It's now 5 p.m. my time anyway, 6 p.m. Europe time. Welcome everyone to my session. Let me just start my countdown timer. Try and keep an eye on. So I'm going to give you a session about using REST APIs with PowerShell, something I do a lot for a number of different vendors, a bit of community stuff as well. Reason Vienna's crossed out there, A, because we're not in Vienna, or some of you may be, but also because I didn't get to go to Vienna because I got COVID from my troubles a few weeks before, but I survived. So here we go. Mostly demos, I hope. Thanks to our sponsors, of course. As ever, these events wouldn't be able to take place without them. A bit about me, but you can read that if you want or not. But basically, a long time before I got into PowerShell, I was writing Unix device drivers back in the 1980s on green screens, on serial terminals. Yes, those were the days. So I've got a bit of sort of background of professional development before I got into the PowerShell. I've only been doing PowerShell now for about 8 years, but I've done a lot of C, C++, C#, and so on. Anyway, enough about that. So why use REST when we've got lots of Azure commandlets? I mean, this isn't just for Azure. I'm going to focus on Azure with demos today, but I also use these with Citrix, with VMware. I can use them with Microsoft Graph as well as Azure, although the two are kind of the same thing, although authentication is subtly different. But certainly for my customers, it's a case of they don't need prerequisites. The PowerShell is kind of hidden from the customers when they run it. So if they say, "Oh, you need to install this module," they go, "What's a module? How do I install it? Where do I install it?" So using REST when we're just invoking effectively web calls, then there are pretty much no prerequisites other than PowerShell. And what I'm going to show you today is working PowerShell 5. PowerShell 7 is better, a couple of reasons, but also gives us more portable code if we need to port it somewhere else as well, particularly where there aren't those commandlets available if we're doing PowerShell on non-Windows platforms, which is possible, I believe. I don't know how much people do of that, but and then REST is kind of REST. Once you learn the basics of authentication, sending requests, checking statuses and so on, it's really then just a case of getting hold of documentation, if there is any, and samples. Of course, I love getting samples from vendors, and the scripts I'm going to use today are also publicly available, not on my GitHub, but I'll explain where they are later, because I've written a lot of functions to wrap around the REST to make things easier for me as well. So I'm writing a lot of Azure scripts, particularly around AVD at the moment, so I can then reuse the functions and the code very quickly. Also, something I kind of perceive, I've not measured it, but again, if you want to use some of the measure commands, you could do this. I feel it's faster than the PowerShell commandlets. I'll talk about the PowerShell commandlets later as well, because they are actually quite useful, particularly when the documentation is lacking. And why not? Yeah, you might say, well, I can use a PowerShell commandlet. Well, I just use REST. There was quite a big learning curve with REST, but now I'm there. It's pretty easy for me to churn out new modules, new scripts. Okay, so let's talk about the Azure REST APIs. I need to use one example, and probably this is more common to, or more used to you folks, rather than some of the Citrix stuff I've done previously, or VMware for that matter, because I'm in the sort of end user computing space. So what can we do with it? Well, yeah, automation. Everything's about automation these days, isn't it? But yeah, not just automated deployments and stuff, but making changes, monitoring, alerting. And pretty much if you can do it in the Azure portal, you can do it in REST. Sometimes it might be a bit difficult to figure out how to do it, and you can do a whole lot more in REST as well. So a typical workflow is authenticate using OAuth, which we'll go into in some demonstrations shortly. Number of different ways we can do it, but the best way I find is using an app registration. So we do that once. In fact, the one I use today, because I'm going to show the client ID or application ID and secret, it's actually only valid for a day, and I'll go and delete it as soon as this session's finished. So the window of opportunity for malicious intent on my test tenant is small, but we get this bearer token thing, and then we just pass the bearer token through to all our other calls, and then we this technical term do stuff, where we all the usual PowerShell approved verbs. We create things, remove things, change things. One of the, if you like, nuances with the Azure API, REST API, compared to some of the others I use, is that we need to specify an API version. I'll make these slides available afterwards. That's a link to a quick bit of PowerShell that will show you how to get the latest version of the API. And the function that I've got here will also figure out the latest version of the release version of the API if you need it, because I wrote a script that will query every resource in a given subscription or resource group, and trying to figure out all the API versions manually for that was a pain. So I made it sort of do a dummy query where it returns a list of the valid APIs, and you just sort them and pick the latest release one. And your authentication will expire generally after an hour or 3,600 seconds, which it tells you in your response. So you need to figure out what happens if you've got something that runs for a long time. They might think, well, no, nothing I'm going to run is going to take that long. But one of the scripts, for instance, I've got is a wrapper for good old MSTSC, which will assign in or create a new public IP address, run up an MSTSC process for that, having created a network security group rule which only allows your external IP address to access port 3389, but it will do other ports. So if someone's got that MSTSC open for more than an hour, when they quit it, I need to tear down the public IP and the network security group rules. So I need to reauth. So again, that code is available. And the other thing with Azure, and with quite a lot of other APIs as well, certainly with the Citrix ones for their cloud platform, then not everything's returned in one page, and we'll see that in the example very shortly. So that, if I've got 600 results, it might come in 6 pages of 100. It almost certainly won't come down in one go of 600. So I need to, or we need to be able to cater for that in our code. Okay, so the credentials side of things, we'll go and look at a demo very shortly. I know I keep threatening these demos, but I do demos, honest. So yes, if you use Azure and you haven't authenticated and you've got the Azure commandlets, then it will prompt you in a nice little browser window, but that's not really good if you want to do something at 3:15 in the morning out of business hours, because it's sat there prompting while it's not doing anything. And we can't do that with REST anyway, as in calling REST APIs won't automatically invoke a authentication dialog, which the Azure PowerShell modules will do. But again, it's no use if you're not sitting there watching it at silly o'clock. So what we do is create a service principal, as they're known. So hopefully you all know how to do this. If you're working in Azure, create an app registration, which is pretty straightforward. I created one earlier just for this demo. So let's bring that up over here. App registrations. So you can see I created one there, psconf.eu. So I've got an application ID. This is something I use, and then there's the secret that I created once off. And again, you need to make a note of when you create it, and then you give this permissions to the objects that you want it to be able to either read or change. So contributor or reader or more fine-grained at the resource group or subscription, wherever you need it to be. Which I've just said. And the thing to remember is, what's going to happen when the person who set that up leaves. So you've got to make sure your code can work with alternate credentials, because ideally if that person leaves, well, they could have a copy of those credentials or any other credentials you're using. So it's probably best practice to change them. You can retire them immediately in the Azure console, but then how are you actually going to get new credentials into your script? Okay, so let's go to a demonstration. I know you're going to all laugh at me, but it's fine. I don't mind. I'm going to use ISE because I'm old-fashioned. But also I've had a lot of problems with VS Code, so I stick with ISE, particularly as I used to do a lot of coding on customer systems as well, and you've got to go for the lowest common denominator, which is ISE, particularly as I'm using pretty much PowerShell 5. One of my customers, if I use anything above or need anything above PowerShell 2, I get shouted at. So what I'm going to do is run this script, and again we can't use Control-L for searching in ISE because Control-R just toggles that upper pane, but I can type a few letters and then hit Tab. So this is going to invoke a script that reads the Azure activity logs for a script I wrote, again, which I can make is actually available now. So first of all, we're going to go and get a bearer token. So I've set a breakpoint in good old ISE. I've told it to go 60 days back. Why 60 days? To make sure I get a lot of events. So this is in my bearer token function, so you can see we're calling, let's have a look at I'm splatting the parameters from that hash table. So I can do it all in one go. You can see I'm calling to an OAuth v2. There was an OAuth v1 where the properties are subtly changed. It still works, I think, v1, but I changed it to v2 to hopefully make my scripts have a longer life. And then in the body, we have the credentials that we're passing. So scope, what type it is. Again, this is all in the documentation. You see what happened. What I tend to do is put a reference to the documentation, so you can RTFM, as we say, if you need to, near where I'm calling the method, so it's easier for people to look it up if they need to. So I'll call that. Again, feel free to take a note of client ID and secret, but as long as I remember, I'll revoke those as soon as I finish my session. Actually, it's now going in and doing a second authentication. Why? Well, let's just bring this stuff up and let's have a look at the body again. You can see this is subtly different, whereas before I was authenticating against Azure. This time I'm actually authenticating against Graph. Why? Because I need to do some AD stuff as well. And of course, Graph is the future of everything, the future of mankind, if Microsoft is to be believed. So actually doing two authentications, but with the same credentials. These credentials I've actually stored in a CLI XML file so that I can have them locally on my profile, but they can only be decoded by my user account on this machine. So it makes them relatively secure. And if someone's got admin privileges, they could come in and reset my password and log in as me and get them. But if they've got admin privileges, you've probably got bigger problems. There are other ways to do it as well. I mean, you could look at Key Vault, but then you've got the problem of chicken and the egg. So if we now come out of here, go back to my code, that's where my graph bearer token is. So we can see a graph bearer token, if you look at the screen, is a nice long string, and that's what we need to pass through to further calls. So if I F5 it to continue, so we'll stop just before I'm invoking the REST method to go and get all the log entries. So you can see there's my filter. Again, I've got a reference to the API definition in the documentation there, and the documentation, the Microsoft Azure stuff, it's pretty good, I must say. A few mistakes here and there and a few things missing, but again, you can feedback on GitHub on those things. So here's my URI, sorry, just trying to engage my gear, my brain in gear. It went into neutral for a moment, so I've got a bit of filtering. Notice I've got the API version in here as well. That's quite an old API version. Do I need to use the latest? Only if I'm using features which weren't in the older ones. I don't think there's a newer one than that, but again, it doesn't matter. This code is working. That's the important thing. I'm doing some filtering stuff again as per the documentation. So with filters, it's generally getting the things like the date timestamp in the correct format. ISO whatever it is, that one I think. And this is resource group specific. So there's my query. So what I'll now do then is I'll F5 that to continue. And now I'm in my one of my helper functions. So my invoke Azure REST method. So this is a function I use in many of my scripts, which is sort of evolved over time. It has things like retries now, because one of the things, there's a slide I probably won't get to because I generally usually run out of time on this, but I'll make available, where it's a good idea to cope with sort of transient errors you get in Azure. I don't know if you've seen them yourselves, where occasionally it'll give you an error 500 or something like that, and then you try again 5 seconds later and it works. So I've got the ability in here just to do the retries. So if you get access denied, then it's unlikely to work 5 seconds later unless something's changed. But if it's an error 500 with a back-end issue, then a couple of retries later with this amount of time between the retries, and it might work. So it'll just give you a better chance of success. So you can see in here we're building a header, which is just our bearer token, which is passed through. You can see that bearer token is again a nice long string. There we go, too wide for the screen even. So I passed through again. I've actually already called the REST method, so let's have a look at the hash table that I splatted for it. So I'm getting URI in the headers. Again, there's my bearer token. I'm telling it I want some JSON back, because that's nice and easy to work with in PowerShell. Does stuff for error retries and so on. Again, you can have a look at that if you go and grab the code. So now what I'm sat in is I'm sat inside a do while loop, and I've actually got a next link. Now, something I do, which is PS Script Analyzer doesn't like it, is assigning and testing in the same statement. It's frowned upon in C++ as well, but it makes a more compact code. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying if there is this next link available in the results. So let's have a look at the results. Oh, I'm assuming the screen, the font size is okay because no one's complained in the chat or verbally. Says here looking over to make sure he's not muted, which would be quite amusing in a not very amusing kind of way. So you can see the result I've got back tells me I have a next link. Well, you can see it's got next link because it's so long. Let's have a look at all the members we've got. So you can see we've got a value. Which is 200. That's interesting. It seems to have increased from 100. I noticed this earlier. It used to do things in 100, which is what I say in the slide. And I don't know if it increased capacity or their confidence, but it seems to be returning things in chunks of 200 now. And we can see the results. We can just pipe them through a quick grid view. Good old grid view, one of my favorite commandlets. Some of the properties aren't interesting, but we should be able to actually see some content somewhere here. Operation name. So this is what it was doing, etc., and various other properties. But again, that's kind of not the point of this. What we're saying is there is a next link. So because the next link is present, what that means is we have to go and invoke, well, we don't have to, we could stop at 200 items, but the very fact there is a next link property there, as we see, tells us there is more data. So we need to go back and get it. So if we just F10 through this, so I go back around my loop, I call it again, but this time with the next link. So we can see, if you see a next link, let's see if we can just display that better. A next link parameter generally has you can see there's a whole lot of other stuff on the end that I didn't add. So that's, that makes it quite a long URI, but hey, as is not the reason why, as is just to call it. So again, F5 on that. We've got a next link again, because you see if the next link is null, then we go down there. So let's F5 that. Another set of results. So now I'm down here because next link in that response, I've got no next link. So that tells me I've got all of the results back now. Where have those results gone? Well, what I've been doing with these is adding them to an array. And again, it says in the notes, be careful, don't use plus equals on an array. because that will take a copy of the array every time. So if we step out of here, what I was doing is just returning everything. So again, this stops PowerShell from flattening things. Some people say, oh, you don't need to say it's an array, guy, because it's obvious. Well, I come from a C++ background where you have to type everything, as in strongly type. So I like to strongly type everything. You see my date times and my strings and everything else. It's easier for the environment to catch errors earlier on. So we can see $all events is the result of all of my queries, and the count of that is 616. So I'm guessing it's done 4 queries because it seemed to be doing 200. But again, we don't hard code it to 200. We just wait until that next link parameter is null. So that's the result paging. Yeah, when I wrote these slides a couple of months ago, it was 100. Now it seems to be 200. But perhaps they change it based on capacity, load, etc. So it's the next link. Follow it. Same headers, so you need to have the same bearer token. If you don't pass the bearer token, then it's going to give you access denied. Again, because the next link is different each time, I just check it's not the same as the previous one. I don't want to go into infinite loops. So as we saw, next link isn't there. And as I said, don't use plus equal for simple arrays. Use these system generic lists, which have an add, or just return all the results from the function by outputting the object to the pipeline and then capturing it at your calling end. Something similar to that. Okay, so the last thing I've got to talk about in the last 10 minutes or so is asynchronous operations. So there's 2 types of operation you'll get. One is where it will wait and finish the operation and tell you whether it is succeeded or not. And a lot of operations, because they take a large amount of time, or a decent amount of time, like creating a VM, which can take several minutes, it will actually return almost straight away saying, yes, I've queued the operation, and now if you want to, you can track it. Now you don't have to track it, but if you want to know whether it succeeded or failed, or you want to do something afterwards, so the script I'm going to switch to now is a VM creation one, which has the option to domain join as well. So what I want to do is I need to wait for the initial VM to be created before I can then go and do the domain join. So actually, let's jump straight into the demo. So I'll just Shift F5 and leave that one alone. Switch to a new VM one. Again, go and find the command line for it. So basically, I give it the name of an existing VM, which it's to copy. So it puts it on the same network, gives it the same subnet, gives it the same disks, and it comes from the same gallery image in this case. So it actually installs Windows for you. So you kind of, it's a fresh clone of an existing VM. So it's not going to copy the VM as it is, but it's going to create it from the same source. Give it a name. And as you know from creating VMs in Azure, if you do, then you need to give it a local admin username and password. So I'll go off and do that. Oh, and it pops up a little window, mainly because it can take a long time. And this is actually run inside ControlOps product, where it doesn't tell you what's going on until the script is finished. So if that's going to take 10+ minutes, then it's not great. But another advantage of the fact that we're using these asynchronous things is that what I can do is I can tell it to go off and make 10 VMs in one go, or rather than 10 separate calls, one after the other, and then go and check on the status. So you can see here I'm creating a new VM, going to be called psconf.eu1, and hopefully show this in true magician fashion. There's nothing up my sleeves. Let's go back to where's my Azure, and that's my app registration. Let's go back to virtual machines. There is no psconf.eu in there. So we're going to go and create this new VM. Now what it will do is actually go in and tell it to not use REST. So it's not going to invoke REST method. What it's going to do is actually to use invoke web request. And so why do I do that? Because, sorry, I should have set a point up there. Let me just stick a breakpoint down here. The reason that we use invoke web request is because on these calls which are asynchronous, it doesn't actually, the invoke REST method doesn't return anything, and as you'll see the documentation says it doesn't return anything. So we use invoke web request instead, so no REST was true, which actually gives us more data. So if we look at the result, just make that a little bit bigger, we can see what status code of 201, which is accepted, if I remember correctly. You'll generally get status codes of 201 or 204. And what it will do is give us a link that we can then track. Also gives us a retry. So if we look at the result headers, again, I could use invoke REST method in PowerShell 7 because that does allow me the ability to get my headers even from with a response which has no content. So you can see this tells us retry after. So if that command failed and we wanted to retry it, it's suggesting we try it 10 seconds later. It doesn't tell us any units, but that is seconds, not days. And so if we step through this now, this is what I'm doing, because I'm in a loop now. I'm only creating one VM, but this loop could create 10 VMs. Again, use of write verbose when I'm debugging. So I'm checking the status code is a 200 or thereabouts. And what I do is I actually add an item to the table, or to an array that I can iterate through later, as we'll see. So my headers async operation is I wasn't trying to change it, honest. So another reason I like VS, one reason I like VS Code is I can change the code while I'm actually running it. So if we look at the async operation header, that is the URL. Oops, sorry. That is the, in fact, it's easier going to do it this way, isn't it? That's the URL I will call to give me the status. So you see it's got operations in there and then gives me a GUID for an operation, so I can call that later. So if I just F5 that, that's come out of the main loop for creating the VM. So that could have, in this case, is only creating one VM. As you can see from new VMs, there's just one in there. But this could be creating 10. So what I'm actually then doing, so rather than having to introduce parallelism in the PowerShell code through jobs or run spaces or PowerShell 7 with for each minus parallel, I get Azure to do the parallelization. That's a difficult word for me to say. Thank you for that, Nicholas. But I've lost my train of thought because I'm only single-threaded in my brain at the moment. So now I can go through and check all the statuses, and again I can check all statuses and then do a sleep, because I don't want to be checking the statuses and going bang, bang, bang all the time to Azure and sending out REST requests. So what we'll see is I actually sleep while I'm in the code. So what I'm now going to do is go and look at that async URL from the code. I'm going to go and call it. It comes back, what's my result? Actually, that's in the function, so let's step out of there. So what's my status? Oh, it's finished already. Well, that's pretty quick. Normally it's in progress. I might have to go and run another one in a minute. I've probably been talking too long, but hey, not often complain that demos are too quick, because normally that would say in progress. But what we need to check now is that it's succeeded, which it has. I'm not doing a domain join. So I actually go through. So that's finished it. So what I'm actually going to do now is go through and create another one. Well, I'll see. Actually, if I go for psconf.eu 1, notice it says it already exists. So I'm going to go for psconf.eu 42, obviously. It's the next number after 1, isn't it? Move that out of the way. Continue that. Spend less time talking this time so I can demonstrate. It's gone away this time to go and get the status of it. Oh, I should bring this over here, I suppose, and prove that psconf.eu 1 is running and psconf.eu 42 is now creating. Let's go on that and let's have a look at dollar status. Oh, and my countdown timer has just kicked in with its customizable text. So I'll just finish off this demo and then see if there's any questions. Oh, there is. I see there's a question. I didn't mention invoke AZ REST method, but again, that chicken and egg, that needs me to have those Azure or that Azure module installed. So in fact, these two scripts, all the scripts I write, these are available on ControlUp's script library, for which you don't need a license or to register. You can go and grab the scripts and run them outside of ControlUp. You just specify what you need, like I am here with the Azure IDs. So the Azure, well, in fact, let's look at status. We'll finish that so you can see that's in progress. So I check all the processes and then I sleep for a given amount of time. Notice I don't hard code it. That's again is a parameter to the script with a default of 10 or 15 seconds, I think. And let's F10 that again. What's our status now? So it's still in progress. So again, we'll go around the loop again, and that'll come back again, and eventually it'll finish. Again, we've seen that. So, but what we probably also want to do is build in a timeout as well, so that you say, okay, well, I'm going to go round and round this loop, but if you've been doing it for 3 days, then it's like, yeah, perhaps it's not going to work. So the way I tend to do timeouts is to have a maximum run duration in a number of seconds, let's say, calculate an end date based on that, and then in my while loop I'll have a while status is not in progress and the current date time is less than that end date, and then carry on. But as I notice, we've got to sleep as well, so we're not battering Azure, so we don't hit potentially problems with rate limits and so on. But yeah, sorry, hopefully that was, Hendrik, that was enough of an answer. Is that, I don't use any non-default PowerShell commandlets in any of this at all, because as soon as you need one commandlet, then you've got them all. Good, yeah. I'm not saying there's any problem with the Azure commandlets. I've got them installed on my laptop, and actually if I go back to the slides, just go through all these because I've demonstrated all those. In that, one of my top tips, if the documentation isn't good enough, then I use the Azure commandlets themselves, because if you use it with -debug, then it will actually show you the URIs that it's calling with the parameters and the headers and everything else. And if you do a 5 greater than debug.txt, that just redirects the debug channel, because each of the channels is separate. Standard output, write output is 1. Write host isn't. Write host wasn't redirectable until PowerShell 5. I think its ID is 6. I've already mentioned about catering for transient failures, so the occasional error, so that you don't, if you're partway through a very complex script and you get one error 500, you just stop, and you've got a lot of undos to, deleting of things you've created and unwinding and everything else. Is it really worth it? So that's why I built error 500s, because of my testing of scripts. I've seen them quite a few times. Don't hard code things because they change. I don't think I've seen any of the Azure ones change. I've been doing Azure stuff now for a couple of years. I know the Citrix ones have changed a few times since I've been writing Citrix REST API code. So if you define it in one place, then at least you just change it in the one place, and then you're good to go once you've tested it, of course. Always think, again, this is a separate session I do and something I'm covering in the workshops that I'm offering sort of face-to-face. Watch me on LinkedIn and Twitter for that. Those are coming to a city potentially near you soon once I get some buy-in from people. Is error checking. That the code that I sort of get in from customers and co-workers, error checking is usually the thing which is lacking. What if it fails? Should we carry on? I had one from a customer a couple of weeks ago and saying, oh, there's so much red, I don't know what to do with it. And it was because there was one fatal error right at the start, but rather than aborting the script, it just carried on, which meant error after error after error. And you know what a lot of people like, if they're not PowerShell au fait, is that they see the red errors and they run away screaming, it's broken. So make sure you cater for it, retries, hide errors if they don't make sense, make them more user meaningful. This is missing, go and get this particular module, or go and allow this through your firewall. Always watch for infinite loops because they're never good, particularly if you don't have a sleep in them, so they're chewing CPU as well as potentially, in this case, chewing bandwidth and potentially API rate limits. And as with any code, hopefully you saw in some of those snippets, and if you go to the Control Up script library, drop a link out to later on Twitter, then you'll get that information from there as well. In that, ideally function names, approved verb dash noun, and meaningful variables can be as long as you want, because of course we've got IntelliSense, table, control space, completion, helps make it documented. Because if you've got something called timeout value and you're setting it, you don't need a comment saying setting timeout value. You can actually have too many comments in code, believe it or not. Because a lot of the code can be self-documenting. But if a particular bit of code has taken you a while to figure out, particularly if you've looked at a few things and ruled them out, then make those comments in the code. I didn't use this method because, or if you're ignoring an error, I'm ignoring this error because, put useful comments in there, or it took me a while to figure this out because of whatever. And then put in references to any documentation you use or anybody else's scripts that you use. It's always nice and polite to say, oh yeah, I use this script from such and such. And if you've improved it, and you can, please put it back to the community. Again, my scripts are out there. I've got ones on GitHub and I've got ones through Control Up on their script library. I won't guarantee for any of them, but I do a lot of error checking. I do a lot of testing. But just make sure before you run it in your live domain with 10,000 users or 10,000 devices that it's not accidentally or deliberately going to trash all that. Because if you do, you might not be the most popular person in the world. So look through the script, try and make sure you vaguely know what it's going to do, or if you've got a lab or test environment, run it in there. That was me taking a screenshot, sorry. And with any other questions, or anybody want to jump into the Q&A area and verbally ask a question? Don't feel you have to. I don't mind if there's no questions. There have been a few already. I hope that's been useful. I say that's what I do as my day job. I'm writing a lot of REST stuff for software vendors like Control Up. Oh, someone's running out of the room. Hey, Niklas.
Hello. Hey, thank you. Great presentation. You said that you got error code 500 for transient failures. Have you ever seen that you get error codes like 429 and 503 and 504, etc. for?
Yeah, I was kind of generalizing by saying 500, but yeah, 429 rings a bell. Is that too many operations or something?
Exactly, that's when you're being throttled, so you will get in the header a retry after, but I don't think you will get that header unless you're using invoke web request.
Yeah, that's one of the problems with PowerShell 5 versus PowerShell 7. PowerShell 7, you can give it a minus response headers variable, I think, and that will give you the response headers, whereas that's why my scripts which work with PowerShell 5 or only work on PowerShell 5 will use invoke web request. but with the content type of JSON, so I can still get the I can still get the output easily. But then I get the response headers as well. It's not great, but it works.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I must admit I don't. Yeah, Alexander just put in a link to what I guess is codes, because I think we all remember 200, 404, 401, and 500. Certainly, when you get to my age, yeah, I remember I started coding in the 1980s. When I guess some of you weren't even born. You tend not to remember everything. Well, I tend not to remember why I walked into a room, although I'll remember registry keys and other stuff. So yeah, don't be afraid to look stuff up. It doesn't make you any less of a person if you have to look stuff up.
An excellent website.
Yeah, it's just a good coder, troubleshooter, whatever, just knows good resources where to go and look. If someone says, "I'll go and search on Bing," well, maybe I don't believe them. But if they say Google or DuckDuckGo, then yeah, because we can't remember everything. But again, if you find something out, share it with the community. I use Twitter a lot. Because it can help other people, but more because it helps me. I find something, I think I'm not going to remember that in 2 weeks, or in my case 2 days time. So I'll put a quick tweet out about it. But if I know and I need to look it up later, I can just go and search in Twitter for that, for a term around about that thing, and my Twitter handle Guy Leech. So that
could you show me the part of the script where you had invoke REST method to get the response? Oh, was it web request? Okay.
Well, what have I done? Wrong keyboard shortcut. Yeah, so if the no rest switch is passed, luckily they take the same parameters.
Yep.
But the advantage of the invoke web request is it gives us the headers as well.
Right.
Which, well, you'll see here there's some PowerShell 7 specific code.
Oh, okay. So you're adding the response headers variable.
That doesn't exist in the PowerShell 5 implementation of invoke REST method. I say, unfortunately, I'm constrained to using PowerShell 5 a lot of the time, even PowerShell 3, because my customers sometimes can have Windows 7 out there they need to run PowerShell on where they've never updated PowerShell on them. So I have to go for lowest common denominator. I can't use all this nice stuff in PowerShell 7, particularly as I've found PowerShell 7, I don't know about your own experiences, is generally a lot faster than PowerShell 5 as well. So at some point, I guess I'm going to have, given that PowerShell 5 or Windows PowerShell is deprecated and will stop being patched and so on at some point. Any other questions? I hope this has been useful. This is some real life examples. I've been improving this new VM script today so that it deletes resources because it creates network interfaces first and then creates new VMs. So I've made it so that it'll delete. So again, tidying up as much as possible. And again, if the domain join fails, there's an option to delete the VM, or you might want to go in and see if you can figure out the failure for the domain join failure. And one of the things I'm doing in that script is also using the ability to, you may have seen some of my tweets yesterday, for the run command, so I can actually check if the domain is available and reachable from the source VM if it's powered on, because I don't know if you've had problems with network peering, but I have. When you're on a different subnet from your Azure AD domain controllers, then if you don't have a network peering in place, you can't get to AD, and therefore you can't resolve the domain name and you can't join a domain. So yeah, I've got some scars from network peerings, particularly having tried to do it in ARM templates as well. I didn't have much success with ARM templates and network peerings. Look like you have to do some manual stuff once you've created them, because they need to be reset, which is a bit of a pain. But, yeah, so what I would suggest is if you want to go and get these the latest script, I'll figure out what it is and put a link out on Twitter today or tomorrow. So you can use these functions I've already used, ones which will get them from the client XML files where we store them, for control up anyway, but it's a convenient mechanism. How we get the bearer token by logging on, and then this sort of function I use a lot now for being able to wrap all the various REST calls, passing the bearer token, dealing with page results and so on. And then I've also got a await async Azure operation as well. So to keep, we saw it in the loop, but I can also call this function because sometimes the function will actually return you data as well. Just think of an example of that. In fact, I think it's in this script. Let's see where I call that. Yeah, so this is where I'm calling the, I'm asking it to resolve the domain name through the run command, which you can do. So again, it uses the Azure agent, so you don't need any Windows level access to that particular VM. So I can tell it in PowerShell I want to resolve the name of the domain we're going to join. And again, it sends that off as a, and see we come back as this one as a 202. Again, I could probably do 201 to 204 or something like that, but they are specific if you look at the documentation. But that, as I put the comment in there, says it's accepted. And I call that function which waits for the result, again using the async operation link that comes in back in the header. And I return the output, because the output is actually the standard error and the standard out. So standard error is stuff that usually goes in red. So I can say, well, if I've got no standard output, because it should be the result of the have I still got students in here? No. It should return the result of the lookup, but if it fails, then it'll be in std error. This is a Unix thing, and it will give us the name cannot be resolved, which is in that case I say no. And this is what I mean. Well, I've got an error. I can't join a domain. So why go through the process of creating a VM, trying to do the domain join if I know the VMs on that network can't resolve the name of the domain? So that's using the Azure run method, which is quite handy. You can get it to run a whole script if you want, or just get it to run commandlets. You see, I was trying to get it to authenticate the credentials, but that proved rather difficult, mainly because the agent is, as I've put in here, the Azure agent is running in session 0, and you can't change identity in session 0 because of the isolation that session 0 has since XP. Okay, well I've overrun my slot. I'll be around here if anybody wants to ask any questions for the next 13 minutes or so anyway. I hope that has been useful. Got any questions, chuck them in here, or hit me up on Twitter. Can't promise to, I don't have an SLA with you guys, folks, but happy to try and help for the benefit of the community. It's better if you put it as a public tweet. How do I do this? Because then, even if I don't know, because I'm learning stuff all the time, other people may chip in, and then other people may have the same problem. So we can all help each other. I mean, the power of the community. I love the community. Right. Well, I hope it's been useful. Enjoy your next track.